A nyní mi již dovolte představit prvního řečníka. Bude jím Dan Kittredge. Dan je zemědělec a výzkumník, zároveň je propagátor, lektor. Je nadšený do tématu kvality potravin. Dan věří, že potraviny mohou obsahovat mnohem více živin, než se v dnešní době pokládá za běžné, či snad někdy i možné. A nejenže tomu věří, Dan na toto téma provádí rozsáhlý výzkum, sbírá vzorky od mnoha farmářů a hospodářů napříč kontinenty. A tyto první výsledky z těchto výzkumů se mu podařilo publikovat v prestižním vědeckém časopisu Nature. V tomto článku prokazuje 3 věci. Za prvé, že hustota živin v produkované potravině, představte si mrkev, pšenici, něco takového, hovězí, se může dramaticky lišit. Variabilita je vysoká od jednoho zemědělce ke druhému, a to i když hospodaří těsně vedle sebe. Za druhé, že jediné, na čem to záleží, jak vysoká ta míra živin je na tom, kolik aktivity, životní aktivity v té půdě mají, kolik tam toho žije, kolik tam toho dýchá, přes CO2 respiraci měřeno. A za třetí, že tu hustotu živin lze měřit něčím malým, co můžete držet v ruce. Sám navrhnul a vyrobili prototypy těchto přístrojů, které přes spektrometrální technologii, neptejte se mě úplně moc, jak to funguje, když pošlete světlo třeba na tu mrkev, tak ono to načte nějaké hodnoty a jste schopni na místě poznat, že například vaše mrkev má 10krát tolik živin než mrkev vašeho souseda, kterou vyprodukoval váš soused. A co je ještě zajímavější, že tohle jsou nějaké první pokusy. A o co se Dan kam míří, je, aby, když vytáhnete z kapsy svůj telefon, aby v každém z těch telefonů byla v dohledné době funkce pomocí těch kamer, co jsou tam vzadu, že když půjdete do obchodu a cvaknete tu mrkev, tak najednou vidíte, že mrkev v téhleté přepravce má 10krát víc živin než mrkev v téhleté přepravce. A jenom si začněte představovat, jaký to má dopad do nákupního chování spotřebitelů, pokud tuto informaci budou mít během nakupování. Takže konec mého povídání. Ještě jedna důležitá věc. Přednáška bude v angličtině. Nicméně pro ty z vás, kteří potřebují, budeme pomocí lidské inteligence, my nepoužíváme umělou, používáme lidskou inteligenci, takže tady bude probíhat sofistikované tlumočení, kdy se zároveň přepisují titulky do češtiny na obrazovku. Takže doufáme, že všechno vyjde v pořádku. A na konci budete mít možnost v češtině položit otázky, já je přeložím, Dan je zodpoví. Takže to je snad už úplně všechno. Dan, welcome to the stage. Floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. This is my first time in Czech Republic, in Prague. I'm honored to be here. I think I got a basic introduction there. I'll stand right here. Okay, so you can see here, this picture is the farm I grew up on. I'm not quite sure what's going on with the sound. I grew up in Massachusetts, in the United States, on a mixed farm. My parents were leaders in the organic movement, helped write some of the first organic standards in the US 40 years ago. And my work started when I got married, and after managing my parents' farm for my teens and 20s, thought I would be a farmer and raise my children on the land as well, and realized that I, like a lot of farmers, struggled with pest pressure and disease pressure, and had a hard time making a living. And it was through the process of going to conferences, reading books, attending seminars, and sort of deepening my understanding about how to work more well with nature that I got to a point where not only was I able to have crops that were pest and disease resistant and had better yields and lower cost of production, but also had increased nutritional value. And so after growing up on a farm and farming for more than 20 years and not having a model of actually being able to make a living viably, economically, and have a high quality of life. When I was able to put these pieces together and see the connections between working well with nature, increasing quality of life, decreasing cost of production, but also improving human health impacts by nutritional value, I felt a need to start educating around these topics. I was not aware of any organization or network, either whether it be permaculture or agroecology or biodynamic or organic. Now we've got the words like regenerative. None of them was actually focusing on nutritional value of food as the objective. I would argue, as farmers, our primary responsibility is to produce food, not to produce volume of crop, but to produce food. And that, at its core, is nutrition. I was not aware of any actual conversation going on where we're discussing the nutrient variation in food. Has anybody ever had a tomato from the garden in August? Yeah? Anybody ever had a tomato from the store in January? Yeah? Did you know that we're all animals? Yeah? Did you know that God, nature, evolved in us very sophisticated nutrient monitoring systems called our noses and our tongues? When you taste a tomato in August from the garden, that's your inbuilt nutrient monitoring system telling you that's good for you. When you taste the tomato from the store in January, it's your inbuilt nutrient monitoring system telling you it's not good for you. When your children don't eat their carrots, it's because they're animals and they know better. Those carrots don't taste good because nutritionally they're inferior. Actually, there's a dramatic nutrient variation in the food we have access to, and that correlates with our health, with soil health, with farm viability, and any of a number of other, I would argue, quite important topics. So starting this work 15, 20 years ago, there was no word for this conversation. So I created this word, nutrient density, to attempt to begin to have a conversation around this topic. We founded an NGO in 2010 with the mission to increase quality in the food supply. By quality, we're talking about flavor, aroma, and nutritive value. Our thought is that the ambient level of nutritional value in food next year for everyone should be higher than it is this year, and it should proceed in that direction. Actually, as we've proceeded in the last number of decades to industrialized agriculture with efficiencies of scale, fertilizer, chemicals, etc., we may have gotten volume, but we've actually decreased nutrition. There's a direct connection between nutritional value in food and chronic disease in humans. It may not be quite as bad here as it is in the US, but I can promise you another half a generation or so, and you're going to have a lot of children dying from disease, like we have in the States. There's a thing called epigenetics. The environmental conditions of your mother and grandmother affect your health. As we're 2 or 3 or 4 generations into eating food grown in a way that is not well, that has low levels of nutrition, we begin to degrade ourselves. So this concept is actually the purpose of farming is to produce nutrition, to produce food, and we can organize ourselves around this topic for not only farm viability and ecosystem function, but actually human health as well. As an educational organization, our initial work for a number of years was courses, workshops, conferences. We can see a few people here who are somewhat famous in the global scene. As educators, we've had speak at our conference. This was our initial work. In the past number of years, we started to really look into this question of nutritional value in food and to see what the scale of variation was. Our thought was that there was a dramatic scale of variation. Our thought was that it connected to soil health and not to genetics or soil type. And our thought was that we could build handheld instrumentation to assess that variation. Our vision was if we could give people who buy food for their families the ability to choose based on nutritional quality. If you had 3 cartons of milk, 3 steaks, 3 apples to choose from, and you could flash a light at one, 20 out of 100, 40 out of 100, 80 out of 100. You might choose the 80s and leave the 20s on the shelf. That was our vision. If we can empower people who care about their families to choose the best food for themselves and their families, using economics, which is a very powerful force in today's day and age, we can incentivize the supply chain to focus on nutrition as opposed to volume. We did a bunch of work over a number of years. You can see here, this is just the 2020 data. Each one of these graphs, or the green dots is a farm. Those farms were sending in the crops in triplicate. They were sending in the soil that those crops grew in at multiple depths in triplicate, top 10 centimeters, next 10 centimeters. And those farmers were sending in a long list of management data. What was the variety? Where did you source it? When did you plant it? How did you prepare the soil? What was your fertility program? Did you irrigate? With what? How often? Just a whole bunch of environmental conditions data. You can see on the bottom left there, these are some of the compounds and nutrients that were assessed in the crops. Here you can see sort of some of the soil metrics. You can't see them all because they're underneath the text. On the right, you can see the number of crops that we sampled that year. We got over 10,000 samples of crop that we harvested in this multi-year process. I've got some graphs here on wheat. I usually give graphs on carrots, but here I've got some wheat graphs showing the connection to tillage and soil carbon. People are familiar with this topic of soil carbon. This is a Carbon Egg Conference. 0 to 10 centimeters. The level of tillage is showing a decreased level of soil carbon, and 10 to 20 centimeters as well. The depth of the tillage correlating with the level of soil carbon. Here we can see the connection to tillage and nutrient levels. So heavy tillage is in blue, light tillage is in red, and we can see direct connections between how we disturb the soil and the effect on nutrient levels. Antioxidants, polyphenol, protein, magnesium, calcium, iron, potassium, sulfur, zinc. We're decreasing in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% decrease in nutrient levels in food based on how that soil is treated. Right? There are dramatic nutritional correlations in the food based on how we manage the soil. I don't think we properly necessarily understand the overall implications of our actions, but here's some good data to begin to see these connections. Here we're looking at the nutrients in the wheat and the oats. On the left you can see the wheat, on the right is the oats. So this is in, percent of daily recommended daily allowance. So here's wheat, there's calcium. So the lowest level we found of calcium was 5% of the recommended daily allowance, and the highest was 12%, more than 2.5 times variation. Copper, 64 to 145, iron, 26 to 79, 5 to 22, magnesium, basically nothing to 30%, phosphorus, 3.5% of recommended daily allowance to 57%, zinc, from nothing to 35%. There's a dramatic nutrient variation in our food based on how we grow it. All wheat is not uniform. All oats are not uniform. All carrots are not uniform. You may have on the bag in the grocery store or the package in the grocery store a number which the government approves to tell you this is what the nutrients are in this food. That number comes from an average from a small number of samples that are tested once every 10 or 20 years. So literally, every 10 years, they'll get 10 samples of carrots from across the country. They'll put them into a lab. They'll find the average, and that is what's on the bag for the next 10 years for what's in carrots. It's not that those carrots are actually assessed. It's that an average is developed on a very infrequent basis, and that's what's put on the package. Here with oats, we've got fairly similar from 6% to 12%, 66 to 167, 36 to 62. These are 2x, 2.5x variations. You'd have to eat twice as much of this to get as much nutrition as if you ate one of that, right? This is across the board what we found. These are actually some of the more conservative numbers for what we found. Nutrient variation is very dramatic in our food supply, and it does seem to connect quite nicely to soil health. The way we manage our land not only connects to pest and disease resistance, soil carbon, ecosystem function, it also connects to human health. Polyphenols and antioxidants. Antioxidants are on the bottom. You can't quite see that there. They're down here. This is the antioxidants metric. We sampled a number of farms. We've got 50 farms, 38 were in the US, 12 were in France, 298 wheat samples. And what we found here was there was one group in the northwest US called Shepherd's Grain that was working with farmers in a very proactive fashion to help them improve soil health. The rest of the green samples here were just a random survey of wheat farmers. And these red ones were Shepherd's Grain. This was a group that was actively supporting the farmers and improving soil health. And look, you can see the level of antioxidants, the level of polyphenols was dramatically higher in those farmers' samples than it was in the ambient across North America and Europe. We're seeing direct connections between the practices with which you manage the land and the nutritional caliber of the food. We released in 2021 this handheld meter, which was the conclusion of our initial research project to show that actually not only does nutrient variation exist and it's significant, not only does that connect to soil health, but we can build handheld instruments that anybody can use. Anyone at point of purchase could take and discern the relative quality of food. Our thought is this could be an absolute game changer in the way agriculture is managed globally. Because we understand that money drives the world. Everybody okay with that statement? That money drives the world, right? We have this thing called politics in the US. It's a big deal every 4 years where we think that our vote matters, right? As far as I'm concerned, your vote is your euro. Your vote is your dollar. Your vote is your pound. Whatever your form of currency is, on every day that you spend money to buy food, you are making a decision about what is important to you. And if you were to take that money and you were to direct it here instead of there, industry would pay attention. Companies would pay attention. And when companies pay attention, then the government pays attention. Actually, we the people do have power. Actually, we the people use our power every day. We just don't understand what we're doing. With your choice of the money that you use to buy food, you have a massive capacity to affect change in this world. Our thought is, if we can support people in being able to transparently assess the nature of the choices they have in the supply chain, they can really very positively, very rapidly shift the incentives in agriculture to accomplish these broader regenerative goals that many of us, I'm sure, hold in common. As we said earlier in the introduction, as I understand it, the cameras that we have on our phones currently have the capacity to do this. They have the capacity already to assess these nutrient variations. The question is really just one of calibration. In the last 5 minutes, I'll talk about where we're at in the last few years. This preliminary work up until this point with the first meter was a question of, is this a possible vision? Do nutrient variations exist? Are they significant? Do those variations, if they exist, connect to soil health? And is it possible to build consumer-priced, handheld, flash-of-light meters to assess that variation? By 2021, we'd answered that question in the affirmative. Yes, these things are all true. And so now the question is, what is quality? What is nutrient density? What is 80 out of 100, 40 out of 100, and 20 out of 100 for a carrot, or for beef, or for wheat? No one has defined that yet, and that's what we're doing now. So our first project to study this, we started with beef. Beef is the foodstuff that is used, that is produced on more land surface than anything else, right? There's more land used to produce beef than to produce wheat or milk or coffee or rice or sugar. And so we thought, let's focus on a crop that has a major ecological footprint. this slide is not in focus, I'm sorry. What we looked at here was a suite of different compounds. So every steak, we looked at over 100 different nutrients. We looked at the microbiome in the animals, so over 200 different species of microbes. We had the farmers send in the forage or the fodder the animals ate. They sent in the soil that fodder grew in. They answered a bunch of management questions, data about how those animals were raised. And then we fed some of that beef from these cows to humans for a week and saw what happens to them. And then from these cows to humans for a week to see what happened to them. And then finally some fake meat, Impossible Burger, we fed to humans as well to see what happened to them. So we can overlay the nutrients in the meat against the microbiome of the animal, against the ecosystem function, correlate to the management practices, and connect to human health outcomes. This is our strategy for determining what quality is. You can see here a selection of where the samples came from. You can't see South America. Broad diversity by our regions. Initial results show a compound ratio called omega-6 to 3 is correlating very nicely with what the animals eat. So if cows eat green things, as cows have evolved to eat for many, many thousands of years, they have dramatically higher levels of omega-3 in relation to 6, which correlates with positive human health outcomes. If cows eat grain, which cows have not evolved to eat, they have high levels of omega-6, which correlates with inflammation. Inflammation is foundational in chronic disease. Cancer, diabetes, heart disease, osteoporosis, run through the list of diseases that are becoming epidemic in our culture, and at the root of them is this dynamic in the body called inflammation. At the root of inflammation is excess omega-6. When you feed a cow grain, it has high levels of omega-6. That'll be in the milk and the meat. If you feed a pig grain, you'll have high levels of omega-6. If you feed a chicken grain, you have high levels of omega-6 in both the eggs and the meat. Right? We are raising our animals in a way now that we didn't raise them 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Those loss of flavor in the food has a connection to our human health. In all of the supply chain, in all the dynamics of how we're producing food, we're focusing on producing volume for a price. We're not focusing on nutrition. The implications here are quite significant. The final slide I've got here effectively shows that the broader the diversity of the ecosystem that the cow has access to, the better the nutritional caliber of that meat is. So in almost all cases, at least everything we can find so far, the more well you work with nature, the more well the system functions. The healthier the food is. In fact, the less things you need to purchase, the less fertilizer, the less insecticides, the less fungicides. It's an economic advantage for companies selling you products for you to use these things. It's detrimental to the earth, it's detrimental to your bottom line, and it's detrimental to the people who are eating your food. But there's a whole other world out here of opportunity, and our thought is if we can begin to do the science to show that variation in nutrient levels, to then provide to the supply chain the ability to make decisions, we'll have an incentive for farmers to focus on nutrition as opposed to volume. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. Já bych teď chtěl otevřít prostor pro otázky do publika, takže pokud zvednete ruku, přiběhne k vám mikrofon a zároveň v onlineu můžete pokládat otázky do chatu vedle streamu. Takže zamyslete se nad otázkami a já možná začnu s první. Dan, first in Czech. Vlastně spousta lidí se nás ptá, můžete nám dát ten manuál, jak teda, co mám dělat, abych vyprodukoval nějakou tu kvalitní potravinu. Tak se tam dá vlastně na ten postřeh k tomu. Then, people are actually asking for a manual quite often. Like, what should I do? Tell me the practice I should do so I can grow the nutritionally dense food. Tell me how to do it, Dan.
every piece of land is unique. Every piece of land has a different things that have happened to it historically, has different strengths and weaknesses. Every piece of land is not a chemistry set, right? It's a living ecosystem, and foundationally requires being engaged as though it were a living being. We use the word in English, the term Mother Nature. Do you guys have a term similar to Mother Nature in Czech?
Matka příroda.
Yeah. So the concept of the mother, generally is one that, invokes respect and care and devotion. And I think foundationally, only when you engage your land with that deep, caring, sensitive respect will you get the results that we experience as, fecundity, as flavor, as nutrition, as vitality. So I would say the biggest block in success is in conceiving of our land as simply a industrial workshop where you apply the machinery, apply the fertilizer, apply the seed, and you get the result. In my mind, it's a much more sensitive, nuanced, conscious taking approach. There are some basic environmental conditions that must be present. There must be air, water, minerals, food. It's really about actually the functionality of the microbiome. People think that they're raising plants. I would argue that the bottom of the food chain is the microbes. For how many years has nature been growing plants before God invented fertilizer? Do we know? About 400 million years. Plants have been growing on Earth before we had the brilliant idea of inventing fertilizer, right? Nature has evolved the capacity for plants to grow just fine without any of these products of industry. Traditional indigenous cultures were able to manage ecosystems with brilliant fecundity without the application of any of these products because they were able to work symbiotically in harmony with nature. So really it's a mindset shift. It's about understanding that nature has figured this out, and our responsibility is to be in service to and in collaboration with nature, not to be imposing our will on nature. That being said, as someone who is an educator who has been teaching courses for farmers for more than 15 years, all of our work is for free available on YouTube. It's in English, I apologize, but I'm sure it can be translated. I do 10, 12, 15, 20-hour courses walking through a bunch of these principles from this lens, and they are freely available on YouTube for anybody who's curious.
Thank you. Můžu poprosit mikrofon?
Dobrý den, Magdalena Davis, Člověk v tísni. Moc děkuji za velmi zajímavou přednášku a chci se zeptat, vzhledem tomu, že už 15 let takhle působíte, Dané, a zároveň v Americe je spousta problémů se zdravým jídlem, s hospodařením. Chci se zeptat, proč ještě v Americe není rozšířeno to je ten způsob hospodaření, o kterém mluvíme. Kde vidíte ty základní bariéry a kde vidíte ty cesty, jak ty bariéry překonat? Děkuji. I'll say it in English. Where do you see the main barriers, Dan, to implementing this kind of agriculture? When I think everyone in this room understands that this is the way to go, but the US agriculture is actually very much opposite in many ways. So where do you see the great barriers and where do you see the ways to overcome them? Thank you.
Yeah. The barriers are about $25 million in research money. So this work I was showing you with beef, it cost about $1 million to do beef. Once we've defined 80 and 40 and 20 out of 100 is beef, then we can give that information to any company in the world that wants to build a meter, and they can make those meters and sell them and make money doing it. And then we need to spend $1 million on wheat. Wheat is our next crop we're beginning to work on. And then we need to look at dairy, and we need to look at apples, and we need to look at potatoes. But it's literally only $1 million per crop for the planet to define quality. And then, you know, there's plenty of people who want to make money selling stuff. We can give them that information. So our thought is, once we've defined what nutrient density is, we open it up, we provide that information freely to anybody who wants to take advantage of it, and let visceral self-interest of humans drive the market. So I really think it's actually remarkably simple. It's a very low barrier to entry. I will say here, I got one last slide, which is, if you think what we're doing is valuable, feel free to support us. If we had 100,000 people on this planet giving $5 a month, we could literally get this done in about 2 years, right? It's a bottom-up, we the people, organizing solution. I'm certainly talking to foundations and philanthropies and high net worth individuals. But yeah, it's a question of actually just figuring this out. If we can do the work of figuring this out, and then we can share openly, and we the people can say, we're going to go and do what we want for our children that's the best, and tell our neighbors, our thought is that this will happen real fast. Real fast. If there were 5 people in this city that had a meter, and they were able to each go to a different store, flash lights, upload that information to Facebook or Instagram, this week you know which store has better carrots, which store has better apples, or in your store, which apples are better. Our thought is those apples would start leaving the shelf, right? The bad ones would stay and the good ones would leave. Like, we the people can do this. It just simply requires good science to actually have solid calibrations, and then I think it's remarkably easy. Thank you.
Thank you. Jen drobná oprava, neschání $25 miliard, co bylo v titulcích, ale $25 milionů, takže mnohem dosažitelnější, aby dokončil výzkum. Tak prosím, další otázku dáme.
Dobrý den, Šašek, soukromý zemědělec. Porovnávali jste kvalitu, ku příkladu masa, volně uloven zvěře v kulturním prostředí, to znamená v obdělávaném zemědělství, a třeba u vás kvalitu masa v Yellowstoneu, kde se nehospodaří vůbec, a výsledky? Děkuji.
So the question is, whether you have compared the quality of meat from freely hunted game in a cultural environment, like civilized environment, compared to, for example, something hunted down in Yellowstone, a bit more kind of natural environment. Whether you have done some of these comparisons?
The only meat we've looked at is beef. And what we've found is that as long as you have a reasonably high diversity of plants for the animals to choose from, they'll have a high quality of meat. So it really is, 5, 6, 8 different species of plants for the animals to choose from, and you're going to have high quality food. It can be annuals, it can be perennials, it can be natives, it can be cover crops.
Let me translate.
I thought it was still happening. No.
Neběží titulky, tak že pouze porovnávali kvalitu hovězího, takže podívali se pouze na dobytek, na krávy. A víceméně jediné, co našli, ukazuje tento slide, kde existuje korelace mezi kvalitou toho masa a diverzitou toho porostu, kolik jakých typů rostlin tam roste na té pastvině. A takže to je ta korelace, o který zatím ví. Čím je pestřejší pastvina, čím více druhů rostlin a i různé, ať to jsou mnoholetky, jednoletky a tak dále, tím vyšší ta kvalita. You can continue. Do you want to add something?
No, that was basically the point. Yeah. The diversity.
Rozmanitost.
You need diversity. Yeah.
Tak já poprosím, tamhle vidím další dotaz. Máme mikrofon.
Thank you very much. My name is Vlastimil Zedek. I work for the Ministry of Agriculture. and thank you for a wonderful presentation and very interesting information. I have two questions. The first one, how exactly the bionutrition meter works. It seems to be very simple that we will have it in our iPhones or just with the simple camera. And the second question is, if you produce food in your farm with higher nutrition, are you anyhow rewarded by those who buy your food, by grocery stores or any retailers? Thank you.
Yeah.
We got the question translated. Oh,
will my answer be translated?
Ještě jednou v češtině, ale myslím, že jste to všichni zachytili, takže v zásadě otázka byla, když budeme mít tenhle přístroj v obchodě, jakým způsobem na to budou reagovat ty supermarkety. Možná vás pokusím, jestli to můžete zopakovat česky, já jsem trochu dával pozornost. Mikrofon?
Jakým způsobem přesně funguje ten přístroj, který má měřit ty nutrienty, když jsme v obchodě?
Jasně.
A druhá otázka, jestli producent, který tady ten systém používá a produkuje potraviny s vyšší nutriční hodnotou, tak jestli on teda přímo je nějakým způsobem oceněn těmi nákupčími, to znamená, jestli prodává své potraviny za vyšší cenu, když mají lepší nutriční hodnotu.
Děkuji. Dan?
Two questions. The first question, how does it work? The answer is through science called spectroscopy. And effectively, everything in chemistry is a vibration in physics. The way we know what stars are made up of is not by going there and sampling them and bringing them back, but actually because we can read the light coming off of them. And you ask an astrophysicist what Alpha Centauri is made from, and they'll say, well, it's 48% helium and 51% hydrogen and 1% other gases. And you're like, you've never been there, right? Because hydrogen vibrates at a certain frequency and helium vibrates at a certain frequency. And we can take a picture of that light and see what something's made up from. We can actually read what is in the atmosphere of planets 10,000 light years away. And you know how far 10,000 light years is? 10,000 light years is a long distance away, right? We can tell what the atmosphere of a planet 10,000 light years away is with a flash of light. If we can do that, we can figure out what a carrot a millimeter away is made up of, right? We have now the capacity to have, small pieces of technology which are scientific instruments. As a small NGO, we were able to build this meter, which is quite rudimentary. And yet, we were able to calibrate it to nutrients in 10 different crops with a flash of light to a statistical significance that was sufficient to be able to be published in Nature. If we can do that as a small NGO, what do you think Apple and Samsung and Google can do? Right? We have this capacity at this point in time to do what was science fiction in Star Trek not long ago. Right? This is called spectroscopy. It's a science that's available to us. I don't think this technology is the answer. I think the real answer is our nose and our tongue. I think the real answer is our internal senses of perception. But for the time being, as our culture has been directing us outward and to trust instrumentations and not our own inner insight, let's use something like this to help us remember and remind us to what's important, more important and less important.
Thank you, Dan. Já si dovolím ještě jednu otázku z onlineu. Prosím, je možné zakoupit si Bionutrient meter? Is it possible to buy this thing somewhere?
We stopped making these after making a few hundred, because even though we told people that they only tested specific nutrients in specific crops, they wanted them to be what they weren't. The meter that could test everything in all crops. Our first question was, is it possible? Is it possible to build a handheld consumer-priced instrument that's calibrated to specific nutrients you can assess with a flash of light? And the answer is yes. For carrots, this is calibrated to antioxidants. For zucchini, it's calibrated to polyphenols. For no crop, is it calibrated to nutrient density because we haven't defined nutrient density yet. That's the project where we're working with beef right now for $1 million. And when we're done with that, we'll have the answer for beef, and then someone can make a meter that can test nutrient density in beef. And then we spend another $1 million and we define it for wheat, and another $1 million and we define it for milk. Only when we've defined nutrient density in a crop can you build a meter to test it. So right now we've shown this can test individual nutrients and it can be available at a consumer price point. That was the first question. Is it possible to have a consumer priced ray gun that actually works? Now the question is, what is quality? Because you can't have a meter that tests quality until you've done the science to define it. I hope that makes sense.
Dan, thank you very much. Time is running out. There will be possibilities for people to talk to during the coffee break and during the lunch.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. It was super interesting and see you around.
Okay.
Dámy a pánové, Dan Kittredge.